Hey, how you doing?
Pretty good. How about you?
All is well, all is well. First and foremost, thank you so much for coming on this platform. I really appreciate the work that you're doing, and it's definitely an honor to have you.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
Definitely, definitely. Just to give you a heads up, I'm currently in Ghana, so we're not as technologically advanced, but everything should run smoothly.
All right. Well, I appreciate calling at the uh, complicated hour then. Uh,
Yeah, yeah, it's all good. It's all good. Now, for the viewers who may not recognize you, could you let them know who you are and definitely where you're from?
my name is Mason Peck. I am a professor at Cornell University. That's in New York. I have spent about 25 years in the aerospace industry, some of it at NASA. I was the chief technologist at NASA for a couple of years. And my areas of interest include anything space. So, I'm an open book, Tay. Ask away.
Wow, that's amazing. That's truly amazing. 25 years. Some people, they may work at a job for that many years, but for you to be involved in the aerospace field is just phenomenal. And for the viewers who may not know, what exactly is aerospace engineering?
It's the engineering discipline that involves anything that flies or moves in the air and in space. And now, for my part, I don't really do the aircraft side so much. So when I get on a plane and if it's in trouble, I wish I could help, but I can't. For me, it's about spacecraft. If I were ever on a spacecraft and it was in trouble, I might be able to help. So spacecraft engineering, particularly, has to do with trying to design vehicles that can fly in space, and then all the other subtleties around space flight, including where do you get power from, how could people survive on a spacecraft when there's no atmosphere in space, what would it mean to be on the surface of another planet. So these are huge problems, and they're really, honestly, at the scale of the species. These are humanity scale problems. And I know in your podcast you talk about a lot of humanity scale problems. In my mind, this is one. It's one because all of humanity is helped or potentially hurt by the things that go on in space. So I think it's a high impact thing. I'm honored to have had the chance to contribute to it, but it's also a field that's growing professionally. So engineering as a field has been around for years, for let's say 150 years at least, and aerospace has really only made sense to talk about for probably the last say 70 or 80 years. Before then, space was really just a twinkle in someone's eye. There was not really a practical way of thinking about spaceflight. But we've gotten there now. And in fact, we're so close that jobs for young people in space, or at least working on space things, are fairly plentiful. It's an area that's hiring a lot.
Okay, wow, that's really good to hear. That's inspiring as well. Now, I can ask you, when did you develop this passion for aerospace? Was it something that you dreamed about since you were young, or did you kind of get into it later in life?
That is a great question because I think a lot of people, when they think about problems like space flight, they think of it as sort of I don't know, maybe a young person's aspiration. You see some science fiction movies, you go, that's cool, I want to do that someday. And that's not wrong. I mean, to be honest, I like science fiction movies, I like reading science fiction. Uh, and, fiction has that ability to kind of draw you in with a narrative and tell you something about the experience that personalizes the discipline, let's say the technical discipline that is aerospace engineering. So I think if I hadn't found it appealing on a purely personal or kind of, I don't know, aesthetic level when I was younger, I may not have gone into it professionally, but certainly I did. So, like so many people, we have our own nerdy interests when we're young. And if they don't get beaten out of us as we get older, we're lucky enough to stick with them and try to make something of that. So, yeah, I definitely started with an interest in this when I was younger. But for me, younger means like the 1970s and 80s. So way before your time, when space really consisted of, outside of fiction, it consisted of a few very specific things, right? There was the Apollo missions to the moon in the late 60s to early 70s, the space shuttle program, which hasn't been around now for over 10 years, but that was sort of America's workhorse spacecraft. They got people and technology into orbit for many years, but it really, space when I was growing up was really more about very specific things. You had to be part of a huge company. You had to be a military person. It was definitely a very uh, narrow group of people who were ever going to be involved in space. And that kind of exclusionary aspect of it wasn't really great, honestly. It has changed a lot. And now that since I've become more of a space professional, I guess, uh, I see doors opening all over the place in a way that I wish I could have shown my younger self. Because at that time, I thought, yeah, this is never going to be for me. I'm not smart enough for this. I don't have this kind of experience. There's no way I could ever do this. And so for a long time, I didn't pursue space. I did go to college right out of high school, and I got a degree in English, which someone told me would be a good idea. It's not wrong. I think I've benefited from that, but ultimately, it's a little less employable a skill, than other things you might study. But I kind of changed my mind and went back and got a degree in engineering and particularly aerospace. And at that time, again, to kind of follow up on my earlier point, I was thinking about what would little young Mason think about this. I have the chance to answer a question that he might have asked in the mid '70s, like, what are you going to be when you grow up? And now I can answer that question. So I feel like I owed it to my younger self, then also to my future self. Thinking about what kind of impact I want to have. I think this is a field where you can have a positive impact on society, on the nature of what it means to be a human being in the solar system. And it might sound a little science fiction-y, but I do think people working in this profession do think about that future. Not just because it's futuristic in the sense of Star Wars or Star Trek or something, but it's futuristic in the sense that we all have the right and I think the opportunity to be in space, and probably sooner than you'd think. So I see it that we're at kind of a pivotal point here in history, and I like the idea of being able to contribute to something that's has that much impact.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. The future is near. Now I can ask you this: by you being a professor and you being in the classrooms, what courses do you actually teach, and have you seen a significant increase in the amount of students over the years?
That's a cool thing to think about because the student response to space has changed hugely in the say 20 years I've been at Cornell. Uh, the classes I teach are primarily focused on spacecraft engineering. So there's a so-called Introduction to Spaceflight Mechanics course. That course is everything you need to know from kind of a math and physics perspective about how spacecraft work. So, for example, how do spacecraft stay in orbit around the Earth, which they do? How do they get into space? How do you cause them to move when they're there? For example, how do you use rocket engines and how do you use computers to control those rocket engines? All that kind of stuff is in that first course. Now, I listed a lot of things there, and that's a lot of material. So clearly, it's not the sort of thing you're going to jump into right out of middle school. Uh, but that is a course that happens toward the end of a student's time as an undergraduate. I also teach a class for graduate students, so this is more like master's or PhD level class in a really esoteric topic known as attitude control. Here, attitude is not your approach to problems. In fact, it is how the spacecraft is oriented, like how it's tilted. And that matters because if you have a spacecraft in orbit, it's probably either looking up, taking pictures for astronomy purposes, or looking down, sending signals like direct TV signals or Sirius XM radio signals, or taking pictures of the Earth, or doing other things that matter from the standpoint of where it's pointed, right? Where it's oriented. So that attitude control problem is one where you're really getting at the heart of what a spacecraft does, which again is look and point. Other than that, of course, spacecraft are meant to travel to places, right? So they take astronauts to the moon, maybe someday soon. But that's a relatively infrequent thing. For the most part, you put a spacecraft in orbit and it just kind of goes. It just follows whatever path gravity wants it to take. And we just don't right now have the technology to propel those things in a way that's very different from how gravity wants to send them around the solar system. So instead, wherever they are, we point them to wherever we want them to look. That part is doable. Anyway, that's the graduate course, is the attitude control course. But let me answer the second part of your question too, which is how students respond. So in the last 20 years or so, I noticed this interesting shift. In the early 2000s, I had a class I was teaching. It was called Systems Engineering, which is the discipline of how do you put together complicated problems. In that course, I asked the question just kind of off the cuff, who here wants to go to space? And there's like 80 kids in this classroom, and like 4 people said they wanted to go to space. And I was dumbfounded. I couldn't believe that. Little Mason from 1975, he was, what the hell's wrong with you people? I mean, really? You don't even want to go? Why not? Why not go? So I asked that question again every now and then in class, and I just asked it last year. Basically, everybody wanted to go to space. Now, there could be some kind of peer pressure thing going on. Is everyone raising their hand? I better look like I'm, maybe that's what it is. But I actually think it's something a little different. I think what has changed in the last, say, 10 years, maybe more like 5 years, is how immediate space seems to people. It seems like something that they could really do. No matter what you might think of Elon Musk for one reason or another, his company, SpaceX, has really been successful. It has changed the landscape. It's now possible, or at least very soon it'll be possible, to send a piece of spacecraft hardware into orbit for less than it costs to mail something from, let's say, New York to California. I mean, that is a game changer, right? It's so inexpensive that it hugely democratizes access to space, to the point where now there are high school kids who are building little spacecraft and launching them, which is amazing. So I think that accessibility, the sense that it could be for me too, has made a huge difference. And those people who may have counted themselves out early on don't anymore. And I think that's one of the changes I see. So yeah, I think students definitely like the idea of going to space these days. And of course, maybe there's a selected group that I'm talking to, but same course, same age, I'm getting different answers now than I did 20 years ago.
Wow, okay, that's good to hear. That's inspiring. Now I'm a world traveler. I've been to about 70 countries. I love traveling, but man, going to outer space, that just seems like that's the top. You know what I'm saying? That's amazing. Now,
Well,
have you ever been or thought about going to space as well?
they don't send the old fat guys to space, but yeah, it would be great. I would love to do that. The the challenge, of course, is the cost still, right? So even though you could send a couple of pounds across the country for about as much as it costs to send into space, still you multiply that cost by the number of pounds in a person, you get a large number. So it's more expensive, let's say, than traveling to Ghana, I would expect. Uh, that It's still an impediment for people, right? So the thing about space, though, a lot like just virtually everything we do these days with the computers, the fact that I'm talking to you thousands of miles away, um, not everything in space happens in person. You could be forgiven to think, based on science fiction, that what it takes to explore space is to put on a spacesuit and go, poke at rocks and aliens on different planets. I mean, sure, that's a version of exploration. But most exploration these days is done robotically, and it's mostly done through, let's say, video or remote control or all the things that we take for granted every day because we interact with people this way via our phones or via computers. So it's not probably going to be that different the way in which people engage with space in the near term. What needs to happen though in order for that kind of virtual travel to really work is we need much more communications capability between here and space. And that is happening. So right now there's a couple of companies like Nokia and a few others that are building what amounts to cell phone networks in space. So do you remember the movie The Martian? Did you ever see that one? It was like 10 years ago. So this movie was an astronaut gets stranded on Mars because, I don't know, there's a windstorm and his crew forget about him and they leave him or something. And he can't get in touch with the Earth for a long time because there's no way to contact them. That whole premise is not going to make sense in a few years. The surface of the moon, the surface of Mars, it'll be about as close to us as, let's say, New York is to Ghana. So that change, thanks to communications and virtual connections, I think brings space closer to us, even if we can't get close to space. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. Now that you mention it, I do remember that film. That was a good film. I really enjoyed that. It was so interesting. Okay, now I wanted to ask you about this. The Space Systems Design Studio. If you could talk about that a little bit.
Sure. That's the name of my lab at Cornell. So most faculty involved in technical topics at a university like mine, we have a lab of some sort. It's physically a room, but then it also consists of people So for me, those people are some graduate students not getting a PhD or maybe a master's degree. A lot of undergraduates. Every now and then we have high school students too. Uh, all the people in the lab, we are working towards some common goals. So we are trying to invent some stuff. In fact, one way to think about engineering is it's the discipline of predicting the future. If we do our job right, we use math and computers to figure out what some kind of engineered system, like a spacecraft, is going to do, how well it's going to perform. So my lab is involved in figuring out ways in which to do that. We have a couple of things that we do that are maybe unique in our lab. One of them is that we design and build and also fly spacecraft. So NASA or the Air Force launches them for us, but we do all the rest of the work. Those projects take a few years. The fastest one I think we did was about 3 years. Some of them take about 10 years, which is clearly longer than any student wants to stay in school, and I don't blame them. When those are successful, though, they demonstrate some new technology, some new space technology. And I'll give you some examples. One of the technologies we demonstrated was very small spacecraft, like the size of like a cracker or something, about that big. That size of spacecraft is not very useful by itself, but because they weigh so little, you could put thousands of them into space and do something that you just can't do any other way. You could, for example, cover the surface of an asteroid with these things and take measurements that no one's ever taken before. Or you could put a large number of them between the Earth and the Sun, where you would get advanced warning of solar storms and other things that actually affect us on Earth. Things like what they're called coronal mass ejections. The sun spits out, just kind of farts out a whole bunch of stuff, and that ends up on the Earth, and it can knock out the power grid. It influences electronics. Anyway, advanced notice would be really helpful because, for example, with a couple of hours notice, you could ground the aircraft so no one's flying and suddenly the GPS goes out and that's the end of the aircraft. You could do something to make more robust decisions about how to direct power on the surface of the Earth. Anyway, a lot of good reasons why you'd want this, but that's why we're trying to innovate in these areas. So little spacecraft is one thing that we've done. We also had a cool idea about spacecraft that can dock with each other using magnets. Kind of an obvious idea, I guess, if you think, well, how would I make things stick together? Well, why not magnets? Sure. There's more to it than that, though, and it's kind of subtle. But all of these problems are ones that, if we're doing our jobs right, no one's done them before, and we, in an academic environment, in a university environment, we can take on that risk and use students to learn something in the process and also invent something new. And then if our impact is what we want it to be, we'll see them actually become real spacecraft someday at NASA or the Air Force or whoever else wants to launch a spacecraft to do something. So I guess that's how we count success. In my job, we don't get commissions off of things. I wish I could say we get paid a lot, but it is what it is. Instead, we want to have an impact. So the research that's done in the Space Systems Design Studio is exactly that. We try to have high impact on, in our case, problems that have to do with next generation spacecraft. Of course, to know the next generation, you have to understand the current generation. That's what the courses are all for. So you take a few classes, you figure out how it's done now, and now you have a chance to figure out how to do it differently. I think if you come into a problem, all kind of fired up and ready to change the world, but you don't really know what the world is, you can't do much that's effective. So we try to start from a point of view where we understand what's done now, but we want to do it differently, and here's how we do it. Hope that makes sense. There's anyway a lot going on there. There's probably at any given time about 50 people in the lab, maybe not physically, but sort of associated with the lab doing things. And we've had a lot of success over the years. We've flown 7 different spacecraft missions, and depending how you count them, some of them were duplicate or sort of double spacecraft. So like 2 spacecraft that dock, I gave you that example. Another case where we had the little tiny spacecraft. In that case, we launched over 100 of them at once in one kind of carrier, one kind of package. And so if you're just going by numbers, we've launched hundreds of spacecraft. But really, I think the right answer is we've done one every couple of years. And for a university environment, and particularly for students who are learning along the way, I think that's a pretty good accomplishment.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. It's empowering. It's inspiring. I really take my hat off to you and the work you're doing, and also to the students as well. Because a lot of times people take for granted. We'll see, okay, it's another satellite, but like you say, this satellite could help. Tell us about the weather or things that may happen. In terms of power, and it really affects a lot of people's lives. So that's really amazing. You see,
It
okay,
does.
now I want to. Oh, go ahead. You got it.
No, I'm sorry. I was just going to say it does affect people. I think there's often a misunderstanding that people working on sort of science and technology problems are dissociated from humanity. Like somehow we're, I don't know, we just got our lab coats on. We're just kind of staring at a bunch of test tubes, and that's all we care about. I would not trust, honestly, engineers who don't care about the people around them and the society that they're part of. And I would even flip that and say the reason to do any of these things is for the people around us. As I get older, I think more and more about my kids and what their future holds. And sometimes I'm optimistic, sometimes not. But I try as often as I can for my decisions to be ones that I'm confident will at least not hurt the future, and hopefully help the future that my kids and the rest of our kids will experience someday. It's kind of a lot to ask, but I think in your daily job, if you're not putting some effort toward making things better, then you're kind of part of the problem, right?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Now let me say, I wanted to ask you about this. You've been a part of so many launches and projects. What do you feel like is the most difficult part? Like, what is the thing where you like, we got to get this right, or you know?
There's the technical answer is it's probably software. You might think that's easy. You can just type it on the computer. In fact, there's a huge number of computer science uh, majors and even kids in high school doing tons of great stuff with computers. But it's surprising how often that's the problem. Like that's what brings down a spacecraft. It's super common. Uh, you would think that the structure of the spacecraft, all the really subtle, mechanisms and the composite structures and all this stuff, that's the hard part. It certainly looks interesting and hard, but that turns out to be not often where the problems lie. So from a technical perspective, I'd say it's software. But honestly, it's not even the technical stuff that's the hard part. It's the working in the context of the government that's the hard part. I'm not some kind of anti-regulation guy. I mean, we have laws for good reason. I have confidence that the institutions of our government are working more or less to our benefit, or at least not doing a whole lot of harm. But in some cases, it just kind of gets in the way unnecessarily. I'll give you an example. So I don't know if this will get me in trouble, but the Federal Communications Commission does an important job of regulating the airwaves. Okay, it needs to happen. Someone's got to take care of it. And whether you could agree or disagree with some things they do, I think on the whole, it's a good and important job to do. But for space, one of the weird things is that they have the ability to approve or disapprove an entire spacecraft mission on the basis of stuff that they don't really understand very well. If it was just that they were controlling the communications aspect and they had something to say about how we, let's say, send radio signals, sure. I mean, that's your expertise. You tell me if I'm doing it wrong. Okay. But, one of the problems they've had in the past was with so back to our little tiny spacecraft, about this big, they were concerned about their causing what's called orbital debris or space junk. As I'm sure you've heard of the problem that basically stuff we launch into space, it's all up there, and it does come down eventually, but it's all kind of there. And there's been movies about this and books and all sorts of TV show stuff. So people have kind of seen it in a fiction setting. You've seen orbital debris hit things, and it's a big deal, and it is a big deal, right? It hasn't yet become a disaster, but it's getting there. It's a problem. So that they're right to be concerned about orbital debris. The thing about our small spacecraft is they're designed specifically not to be orbital debris. And the reason that works is that they're very small and thin. There's like a little card here. If you kind of chuck this card, it'll flutter to the ground, right? As opposed to a piece of material the same mass, like a little piece of like a lead ball bearing or a piece of candy or something, that would just fly out of the ground like a bullet. So a playing card versus a bullet, different physics, even though it's the same weight. Right now, our little spacecraft are like the playing card more than they're like the bullet. They flutter around. So as soon as they get close to the Earth's atmosphere, and the atmosphere extends pretty far into space, actually, they immediately slow down and fall right back down to Earth. And that's on purpose. We design them that way exactly because we're trying not to litter outer space. But the FCC didn't understand that. In fact, even if a number of people there didn't understand it, there was one guy in a particular office who had a bee in his bonnet that this was going to be a problem. And it's not a problem, like factually, mathematically, not a problem. You couldn't get past that. What was weird is that the first time we launched that particular spacecraft, 2014, I guess it was. I'm getting this wrong. Yeah, 2014, I guess. They had no problem with it. And then this guy shows up, and then 3 years later, we launched the next one, and now he wouldn't let it launch. Same exact design, same laws, same everything. He just couldn't figure it out. So the problem here is predictability or determinacy. It's very easy to work within the laws if you know what they are, if you're sure that people are going to apply those laws fairly and consistently, and it doesn't depend on people's personalities. But in this particular case, it's apparently the personality that matters. So we got around that problem in a way I won't describe unless you're really interested. But anyway, that's the kind of stuff that gets in the way. It's these silly little problems that have to do with misunderstanding rather than the actual technical part. I mean, I wish I could tell you that the technical part was the hard part, because then it would justify all the effort we put into the technical part. But really, the technical part's like half of it. And the other half is dealing with all this other kind of silly stuff. I mean, I call it silly stuff. Some people call it working with others. So sure, I guess that's what it is. So yeah, I hope that's an answer to your question. But I do think in the long run, there are enough people around the world who want to see us as a species successful in space that they're willing to be supportive. And that's true across government agencies in the U.S., I think. I've worked with some international governments as well, and it's true there as well. There's always some kind of duds in these places that are just more or less bureaucrats. They don't really think too hard about stuff. But for the most part, I think we all kind of want the same thing. I believe, for the most part, that space is not a political thing. I think most people can get behind what we're trying to do. There are arguments that we could have about how much we spend on space and should we spend on other things. But if you take a look at budgets, NASA, we did this when I was at NASA. We did this little survey. We asked people, how much do you think the federal government spends on NASA? The answer was, some people would say like 20% of the federal budget is spent on NASA. Turns out the answer is 0.4%. So 4 cents out of every dollar that the federal government spends is spent on NASA. Now, NASA is not the only space thing out there, right? There's all sorts of other military space and whatever. But just to kind of calibrate people's understanding, if we completely got rid of NASA because you feel like spending money on space science or space technology is a waste of money, that we should spend it on something else, whatever you think that something else is, you would barely notice a difference in your annual taxes. I don't know how much you pay in taxes annually. Let's say you pay $1,000 a year. $40 is going to NASA. Sorry, $4 is going to NASA. So $4. If you think $4 is not worth it, well, okay, that's your choice. I just feel like it's such a drop in the bucket compared to the other things we spend money on that it's hard to say that we're overspending on space, in my opinion.
Wow. I really appreciate you putting that in perspective, because, like you said, you've been in the field for 25 years. You actually worked for NASA. Now, we're about 28 minutes in, so I wanted to ask you one more question. Now, you were a chief technologist at NASA. What exactly was your role there?
That's a job that allows. So the chief technologist is the kind of chief advocate, the kind of the guy who cares the most about technology at whatever company we're talking about. So in NASA, that's for NASA things. It also means that I was the head of the strategy that NASA has for investing in its technology future. So that means things like, what new rocket engine should NASA design? What new communications technology should NASA invest in? If there were alien technologies, which one should we use? That kind of stuff, right? I'm not saying that there are alien technologies at NASA. So that's an important job, and there's kind of a lot of responsibility, because if I'm successful at it, I get to chart the future for this organization that I care a lot about. I mean, I want the nation to have a great space program. I think that we owe it to the people of the nation, and I think also the people of the U.S. want to see these sorts of things happen. They want to be successful in this regard. So there's a lot going on there. But one of the challenges for being a technologist or a chief technologist is you've got a lot of stakeholders. A lot of people care about what you're doing. I have a boss, and in my case, that was the head of NASA, Charles Bolden. Fantastic guy, by the way, astronaut, Vietnam vet, first African-American head of NASA. He was absolutely awesome, great guy to work for. He had 7 other folks that roughly at my level all kind of responsible for certain things. There's the money guy, there's the science guy, there's these sorts of people. It was really an extraordinary honor to be in that kind of position. It's the sort of thing where you feel like a fraud every day, but you got to step up and really do your best. In that situation where you have all these stakeholders, there's my boss, there's Congress, there's the office of the President of the United States. I did actually have a chance to meet President Obama. That was awesome too. Um, and there's the public. There are various advisory committees for NASA. They all have an opinion on what NASA should be doing. In fact, I'm going to guess that NASA, probably more than any other single government agency, has the most help with regard to who has something to say about what NASA should do. And NASA has to listen because that's its job. It is part of the government. It's part of the executive branch. And when I was there, at least, working in the Obama administration, it was a very positive environment. Science was very upfront. We want to make these changes for the sake of the people of the nation. It was a great message. I was 100% on board with it. And that was a good thing. And again, more or less not political. So I felt, we felt in NASA a lot of support from the executive branch. It wasn't always true from Congress. There were parts of Congress who just wanted to say no to everything the president did, and it didn't matter what it was. And then there are the other stakeholders, the public, who some of whom think NASA should go away because it's spending too much money. I've already argued against that. And some who think that we should be spending way more money on NASA, and yet we're not doing enough. So it's hard to thread that needle to find that path between or among all these stakeholders. But that is kind of the exercise. There's a lot of money spent at NASA on technology. I think it should be more, but that's not my decision to make. At the time, it was hundreds of millions of dollars every year. So again, a lot of money for sure. And we were doing awesome things. We were developing these aerodynamic decelerators, which are kind of like parachutes for Mars. We did some exciting work associated with green propulsion, which is a way to propel spacecraft without environmental impact. A lot of great stuff that we were doing. But as a job, it's a lot of up and out discussions, like talking to my superiors, talking to Congress and stuff. It can be very intimidating in that regard. But it's also something that I guess if you're someone like me who really cares about the outcome, I can lean back on the fact that I feel confident that I am trying to do the right thing. So if I fail, at least I failed doing the right thing. So I guess that's where I landed. I don't think I failed necessarily, but I think I did the right thing.
Yeah, definitely, man. Everything you're saying makes sense. It's very, very inspiring, and it's like I say, an honor to have someone who has dedicated so many years and put so much, into this field. And it's very, the word that I'm trying to say. I think that they should spend more money to do those types of things because it's going to impact our future. Those are things that will be tangible that we can see. Like this is what we spent our money on. This is where our taxes went towards the future.
Well, it's kind of you to say. I'm glad for the rare example of someone who understands what I'm saying. So I appreciate that. Uh, yeah, spending money is one of those complicated problems. I mean, in the government, at least, it's at best a zero-sum game. In other words, if you're going to spend more money one place, you got to take it from somewhere else. I'm sure you've got your choices you would make. There are choices I would make. Ultimately, it comes down to how people vote, and you got to vote your conscience and choose the right people to lead us forward because the wrong choices can be pretty disastrous.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So I want to thank you again, and also I want to thank the viewers again for tuning in. This has definitely been a phenomenal episode. So until next time, peace.